Hi, we're back here for the second of our series of podcasts, and we're going to be talking about training again and how to get the most out of your training. And I'm here once again with Dr. Mike Posthumus.
Hi everyone.
So last time, Mike, we looked in detail at how to structure a training program for an event like PE PLETT, the 4-day mountain bike event that Prudential is sponsoring in February next year. And in particular, we were looking at some facets of that training, such as, when you need to start a training program, how hard you need to ride, how many days a week. We touched on the concept of polarization, easy and hard. Obviously one of the aspects that we mentioned in passing was this issue of kind of rest or recovery. There is a narrative that cyclists sometimes have, or in general, when people are training for an event, where they just think, I should just train as often as I can, pretty much as hard as I can, and that's going to get me best results. What does the science say about how one should approach the issue of rest, and how important is that in a program where people have a goal like a stage event such as PE PLETT?
Well, firstly, it's not true. The more we train, it doesn't always result in better performance. So the key principle to remember is that training is a stress. So if you induce a training stress, and if you train very hard, you are weaker immediately afterwards. You're not stronger. You need a period of recovery to ensure that you actually bounce back through a process called supercompensation, so that you can actually improve. If you're continuously training and not allowing enough recovery between specifically your hard training sessions, you'll eventually just get weaker. So you want to ensure that you are able to bounce back and become stronger between your hard sessions, so that you see adaptation from hard session to hard session, and that way ensure that you're actually improving your performance.
Right. So, practically, what does that mean for people if they're putting together or the principles that we talked about in our previous session? How should they incorporate rest into a program?
Well, firstly, if we talk about how do you know that you're getting better, because ultimately you recover to ensure that you are getting better. So obviously you're not going to be able to get better every single session, but that is why there are hard sessions and easy sessions, and that's what we covered in the first podcast when we talked about polarized training. If we specifically look at our hard sessions, those are the ones we want to be able to measure and ensure that we are feeling better or going better, faster, putting out more power than the previous time we did that session. So for example, you don't have to have a power meter. That might be a luxury. However, if you're doing a certain session, how long did it take you to get to a certain point up the hill, for example? If you're doing a 10-minute effort, how far did you get in that 10 minutes? And use that as your gauge to see how well you're going. And then every time you do that session, ensure that you are actually getting better. If you're not getting better, more than likely you didn't recover enough.
I think that's helpful. What about perhaps the importance for people who've got maybe a heart rate monitor? Can that tell us anything about kind of how fatigued we are? And if people do a hard session and they don't see a kind of standard heart rate response, is there some information there?
So there are a load of potential metrics that could be used. Most of them, however, it is rather limited. Heart rate, for example, is rather limited, because if you are tired, your heart rate would be lower. If you've got significantly fitter, your heart rate at a certain workload would always also be lower. So although there might be meaning in heart rate, it is very difficult to decipher better performance and being too tired.
Right. So as well as kind of incorporating rest into your weekly regime of training, what other factors can we think about in terms of trying to improve your recovery overall?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, there are 3 components to recovery. The first is the one we've discussed in the first podcast and briefly in the start of this podcast, is training program design, and ensuring that our very hard sessions are placed in a training week or in a training program that allows for recovery between them. Right. So that is the training program. That is the first critical component of recovery, to ensure that you recover from your hard training sessions. The next 2 critically important components of recovery is sleep and nutrition. So you're not going to recover if you're not getting enough sleep. very important, and you're not going to recover if you're not refueling your body and putting back into your body what training had taken out of it, and giving yourself the building blocks, which is the proteins, to allow yourself to recover from hard training sessions.
Okay, so I mean, are there any metrics in terms of, you know, how much sleep's enough sleep, or, you know, what, and on nutrition, you know, is there anything people can do specifically, or?
Okay, so firstly on sleep. Now, I'm not a sleep expert, I must confess. However, I can quote some of our sleep experts at the Institute. And with regards to sleep, we would generally recommend anything in the ballpark of 7 to 9 hours. However, there is no set number. It is individual, and every person would have their sort of sleep sweet spot. So you have to find your sleep sweet spot to ensure that you are recovering sufficiently from your training sessions.
Right, and on nutrition, I mean, you know, people take supplements, you know, you can wander into, you know, any pharmacy in South Africa and there'll be a whole aisle with some really big guy there who's keen to sell you a lot of stuff. Does that play a part, or is it just a matter of, you know, eating a balanced diet and making sure that you kind of feel?
So, yes, and it is. So the key really is in the word supplement. It should be seen as a supplement to a diet. If your diet is adequate, if you're eating, as you mentioned, a whole balanced diet that covers all the macronutrients and micronutrients you would need, there is no benefit in taking an additional supplements. Right. So you can reach your targets either through whole foods, which is the preferred means, or you can reach it through supplementing if you are not reaching your targets with your diet. So specifically, you mentioned what amounts do we need? So I would say immediately after training, if it's been a hard training session, key is that we obviously recover. Our carbohydrates are critically important to ensure that we put the glycogen back into our muscle cells, and also our protein. So we would generally recommend you consume 20 grams of protein immediately after exercise.
Right. I mean, I think that's kind of really helpful. I mean, if people kind of find through their training program that they're kind of losing weight, would you expect that to be part of, you know, if you're on a 12-week program, which is kind of where we are in running through to PE to PLETT, or would you generally, should people kind of try and focus on actually getting enough to replace the calories that they're burning in their training program?
Yes, well, that is again, it's very individual. If a person is carrying a lot of excess weight and excess body fat, it would be normal that through following a structured training program and eating healthy, they will be losing body fat. However, if a person is already very lean, you would ideally not want them to lose too much weight, because that might negatively influence their performance.
Right. Thanks. I think that's helpful. Now I wanted to kind of move away from the issue of recovery to another kind of specifics of training, which is dealing with climbing. And in particular, obviously, despite the fact that PE to PLETT's meant to follow the coast, there seems to be an inordinate amount of hills embedded somehow in there.
No, I've done the rest. A lot of climbing.
So, you know, how should we incorporate that into our training programs? And is it important that we practice, for instance, riding on a hill? You know, that's easy in Cape Town. If you go out, you're bound to be on a hill. Whereas, you know, if you're in Joburg, maybe that's a bit more challenging. Do we need to specifically focus on that? Or is it just fine to kind of, you know, plug away with your kind of 80-20 polarized training sessions, you know, and the hills will just look after themselves? So
my recommendation is to not forget about your key principles. You don't want to be suddenly trying to incorporate all this climbing and then literally spending all your time in that sort of middle grey zone 3. What you really want to be doing is keep it polarized. But remember, just because you're riding easy doesn't mean you can't climb. It doesn't mean that 80%, as we talked about in podcast 1, which we have to be smelling the roses, has to be on a flat road. You can use your shifter. You can still go up a hill, just spinning very lightly. Right. So always try and incorporate try and incorporate climbing, because again, especially as you increasing or as you approaching the event, you would want to increase the specificity. So you would want to try and simulate the terrain, but that doesn't mean that you have to go hard just because the road is pointing up. Ride easy.
Right.
Specifically, all the key sessions, when you're doing your hill repeats or your very hard efforts, those should ideally be performed on a climb. So research has shown that intervals performed on a climb is more effective than intervals performed on a flat road. So try and perform all your intervals on a climb, and that will also up the total amount that you are climbing in a training week.
Right. Okay. And can you do some of that? For instance, if you have access to a gym or a watt bike or a stationary trainer, can you simulate some of that with, for instance, kind of low cadence, high torque type sessions? Does that also give you some of those benefits?
Yeah, so in a training program, we would be doing that sort of general preparation work, which is our overgear work, also called low cadence intervals or high torque intervals. We'd generally be doing them quite early in the program, and later in the program we would generally be just increasing the intensity. That can be done or simulated in a gym environment simply through increasing the resistance, right, to be able that you are working within the sort of target intensity we described or in podcast 1 again, sure, where you want to be over zone 4, which means you can only say 1 or 2 words.
Right. Yes. That's normally where I am, I have to say, when I'm cycling. What about the more specifically the terrain on PE Plet? Because there may be some people who are riding who've perhaps done other events, I Need to See or Wines to Wales, where there are people out there in the morning before you ride who are blowing the leaves off the track and it's all kind of nicely manicured. PE Plet's not really like that. It's a bit kind of raw, and it's one of the attractions, I think, of the event for me, that it does bring you something different. You're on logging trails and on farm tracks that perhaps wouldn't normally see cyclists at all. So what should people be doing to prepare themselves for the terrain?
Yes, and so you've mentioned already, the terrain is rough. So ideally you don't want to be spending all your time training simply on a tar road and on an indoor trainer. You want to get out there, get out to trails and ride rough terrain, because it is a different demand on your body and it requires a different amount of overall body conditioning to be able to develop the strength to be able to cope with that terrain. So only recommendation is to not spend all the time on the tar and in the gym and on your indoor trainer, but actually get out there and just ride trails and ride on rough terrain.
Right. Mike, thanks very much. Thanks to you for watching. Hopefully you're finding this series of podcasts useful. The things that we're covering are things that I've really found kind of helpful for me in the events that I've done. And we really look forward to seeing you on the start line, and that you're going to have as good a time as possible riding PE Plet. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.